Welcome everyone to a new episode of a series I like to call History Speaks. This week I'm delighted to welcome Heather Darsie, a passionate historian and author with a unique international background. Her academic journey took her across the globe with enriching experiences studying in Costa Rica and France and travels to Germany that sparked her love for Renaissance history. Inspired by a biography of Elizabeth I, Heather's fascination with the Renaissance grew as she discovered the era's complex blend of familiarity and strangeness. For over a decade, she has dedicated herself to exploring the Holy Roman Empire, unraveling the intricacies of its political landscape. Heather also has a keen interest in illuminated manuscripts, continually expanding her knowledge and eager to share her insights with us all today. So please give a warm welcome to Heather Darsie. Hi, Heather. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. Right, just to start you off, I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate here. If you could go back, because obviously, I don't know, people will know that we're going to be talking about Catherine of Aragon. So if you could go back to Castile in the early part of her life, what advice do you think you would be offering her knowing what you know now?
I would tell her that she was right. So I think, with my book that's coming out about Catherine of Aragon, I go all the way back to the beginning of her family's dynasty. And there are patterns of behavior that Henry VIII unwittingly repeated in England. And even if we just go back to how Catherine's mother and father came to, well, particularly her mother came to the throne of Castile, Catherine's behaviors in England, particularly with the annulment of her marriage to Henry VIII and her suspicions and her behavior, she was right in behaving that way.
It's interesting. It is interesting. But we're going to cover Catherine of Aragon anyway, so we'll obviously cover much more, not so much of her early life maybe, but a background when she's in this country. But I'm sure our viewers would love to know, how did you first become interested in history? And what was your background?
Well, my father, rest his soul, had always been very interested in history. He was more of a American Civil War and mostly World War II and to a certain extent World War I. Those were his interests. And so I grew up with someone who was constantly reading and watching history. And when I was in law school, I asked my dad if he knew anything about the Wars of the Roses. And I think we all have this illusion when we're younger that starts getting shattered when we're teenagers and in our 20s that our parents might know everything about something. Well, the Wars of the Roses was something that my father knew nothing about. So I read about that. And I had read about Elizabeth I, I think when I was in high school. So I was probably about 14 or 15 years old when I started becoming acquainted with Elizabeth I of England. And I read a book about the Wars of the Roses, had a good conversation with my dad. The Wars of the Roses, of course, lead into the Tudors after a certain point. And then I had obtained a Bachelor of Arts in German Languages and Literatures. And so I was excited to read about the German princess. And everything I read about Anna of Cleves was that Henry contracted this marriage, paid a whole bunch of money to bring her over to England, thought she was ugly, and then dumped her, and for some strange reason kept her in England. And none of that made sense to me. So that's what sparked my interest overall. And then I, of course, researched Anna of Cleves, and I've written a couple books about her and her family and the actual reasons why the marriage was annulled. And it has nothing to do with her being unattractive. And they did consummate it. If you're curious about either of those, you can check out my first two books, Anna, Duchess of Cleves, the King's Beloved Sister, or Children of the House of Cleves, Anna and Her Siblings. And from there, I started looking a little bit more at Catherine of Aragon because her elder sister, Juana of Castile, is the one who married a Habsburg prince. And then they are the parents of Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And so with all that tying in, I wound up accidentally or tangentially researching a lot about Charles V and how he interacted specifically with Anna of Cleves' family. But the more I dug into Anna of Cleves' family and their interactions with him, the more I wound up learning about Charles V. And that really exposed a lot to me about the politics on the continent, but also how Charles V's politics would have impacted Catherine of Aragon while she was alive, particularly with the annulment. And so that's how I kind of wound up getting to this point. And I also don't recall reading a book that's readily available to the common person as opposed to an academic book that really goes into detail about Catherine of Aragon's family and how they came to the throne in Castile in particular, and also how they came into Aragon because they were not the hereditary monarchs in Aragon. And I thought that that would be something of interest and hopefully important and valuable to readers. So that's why I decided to write about Catherine of Aragon. And of course, I talk about her in England as well, too, but the book's kind of in three parts, and it starts with her family history.
It's really it's quite interesting what you've said there, and clearly we are going to talk about Catherine of Aragon, and quite possibly you've already said a little bit, because my question was going to be what first drew you to the life of Catherine of Aragon. So maybe you've answered that already. But was there any one particular thing that, or was it just those connections that you mentioned moments ago?
I think she's fascinating either way. She was the wife that was married to Henry VIII the longest. She was a very strong presence in England throughout her marriage to Henry, and she had been present in the country for over 34 years by the time of her passing in January of 1536. And so she's fascinating because I think she had the fiercest personality, in my opinion, of all six of the wives. And she has the most enduring legacy in some ways of all six of the wives. And she's the one who is easiest to access in the sense that there are more items from her tenure as queen consort than the other five, which is due to her being queen for so long. But because of that, I think it's easier to access her and reach and feel like you can gain an appreciation of what she was like and what she valued and things along those lines.
And I mean, there's that longevity as well, isn't there, within the marriage? I mean, 20 years for Henry VIII is a bit of a world record, isn't it, really, I guess, to spend, because he never spent that amount of time with anyone else. So, no. I mean, Catherine's story is captivating. And your passion for her is clear to see. One of the most debated aspects of her early years is her marriage to Arthur. And it is still quite controversial to this day. So do you believe that the marriage was consummated?
I believe in the law. And I believe that there is a papal bull that was issued stating that it was not. And that's what's important when we look at the life of Catherine. The fact that Henry became so crude later on in his life with having his annulment proceedings against Catherine and having testimony about whether or not she was a virgin, that's unsettling to us today. But think about how disgusting that would have been to have a public trial like that back in the 16th century. And we see Henry correct this mistake with Anna of Cleves, where instead of having a public hearing, he had a secret council created to have a hearing on whether or not he consummated his marriage with Anna, and she was not represented at all. So he definitely learned his lesson, but I don't think it matters either way, whether or not it was consummated. I think it's fun to gossip about and to chatter about, but legally speaking, which is, as you might know, I am a trained attorney. I've worked as a public defender. I've worked as a prosecutor. I also am a part-time law professor. So that's kind of how I look at things as well. But to me, it doesn't matter because legally the marriage with Arthur Tudor was unconsummated.
And I think there was something I read the other day about Anne of Cleves, and I don't know if it's true, because I don't study enough about the characters at times. I just study enough to kind of get me through, if that makes sense. But there was a story that I read, I don't know if it was an article or something, that actually Henry accused Anne of Cleves of already been pregnant once. Now, whether she had a child, I don't know. Now, and again,
I can tell you the source of that. So there's a combination of things. So that did not happen. Wherever that was read, that's completely false from the historical record for a number of reasons. But there was a fiction book that came out in 2019 where a whole tangent, or I shouldn't say tangent. Part of the storyline was that Anna had had an illegitimate child in Germany. There's zero proof that that happened. And also
Mm.
with the structure of the court, it would have been almost impossible for that to happen to a young lady of Anna's status. And Henry did say during the annulment proceedings, so he's trying to prove during the annulment proceedings that he never consummated the marriage with Anna, and that part of the that he never fully consented to the marriage because in his princely heart he knew that she was betrothed to, or excuse me, already married to someone else, which this is Francis of Lorraine, and that marriage had been canceled in 1535. So there was never a full wedding ceremony. She was never actually married to Francis of Lorraine. But in part of his testimony, he says that he felt her belly and breasts and that she felt like she was a woman that had been pregnant before or something along those lines. So that's where that came from. Again, he said that because he needed to prove that he had never consummated the marriage with Anna of Cleves, because in that way he could get an annulment as opposed to a divorce, which are two very different things even today, and would have had very, very different consequences for both Henry and Anna if he would have divorced her instead of having the annulment. So that is where I believe all of that came from. And there's zero proof that she ever had a child with anybody.
That's good. That's good to hear. It puts me right. But I mean, there's so many different sources out there today on a multitude of kind of, things about history. And it's very difficult to kind of narrow it down unless you've got, you can go to the source files, if you like, and look at those. For everybody else, it's kind of hit and miss. So you do get a lot of people say, no, this is right, this is right, this is right. And all along, it's just conjecture, I guess. It's just people saying what they want.
They want to cling to the sexy story. And the sexy story, at least with Anna of Cleves, and then I'll stop being on my soapbox about her, is that it's a much sexier story. And for whatever reason, much more poignant that, like we were discussing before, that Anna was ugly. Henry was deceived by her appearance, and he paid all this money and was so disappointed with her, and he just had to divorce her and marry the hot young Catherine Howard. That sounds way more sexy than Anna of Cleves' brother was going around behind Henry's back and instigating war with the Holy Roman Empire and marrying a French princess without Henry knowing, which Henry didn't want to be involved in. So he had to have an annulment for political reasons, then quickly marries Catherine Howard so that no one can force Henry to take Anna back, because the whole reason for the annulment was nonsense. And Catherine Howard was unfortunately just a victim of Henry's because she had the least amount of protection and she was directly in his path. And by marrying her, it would be a lot more difficult to force that marriage to be voided for Henry to be forced to take Anna back. That's much less sexy than what's been presented for the past however many hundreds of years. The truth isn't always fun.
Exactly. Anyway, let's get back to Catherine of Aragon, because we're going a little bit diverse, aren't we, on some of these topics? The controversy then surrounding Catherine's marriage to Arthur certainly raises questions about their relationship. And following Arthur's death, her decision to remarry is, I guess, equally intriguing. So after the death of Arthur, why do you think Catherine married Henry?
I don't know how much agency she had in contracting that marriage. Also, all of her dowry items, or a great deal of her plate and everything, was already in England. And if they could negotiate successfully, and by they I mean Ferdinand of Aragon and Henry VII, if they could negotiate successfully for another marriage, that would be a lot easier than bringing Catherine back to Spain and bringing all of her things back to Spain. Not that that would be impossible. It's not a huge obstacle, but that seems to be one element of why Catherine then becomes betrothed to Henry VIII, the future Henry VIII. Or at least there was a lot of discussion about it during her widowhood.
It does seem as though it's all kind of influenced by both, I guess, personal and political factors. However, talking about a father who played a role in these negotiations, which is equally, I guess, compelling. And it's well known that a father refused to pay the dowry until this marriage happened. So why didn't he just pull his daughter out of England?
It was incredibly dangerous in Castile at the time. And this is what I've been diving into in part two of my book that's coming out. So Castile was, I'm going to leave you wanting a little bit more, so I'm not going to tell you all of it. But Castile in particular, there was disease, there was death, there was catastrophe, there was poverty. People were literally dying in the streets. And at the same time, you have Ferdinand off fighting wars in, I believe it was in Italy, because he was trying to protect and expand the Aragonese possessions in Italy. And I don't know that it would have been safe to bring her back, or that he could have afforded to bring her back with all of this going on. So Aragon, the crown of Aragon was a lot more stable and didn't have the same issues, but depending on what the mechanics were of bringing her back, it might have just been too dangerous to have her in Castile/Aragon at that time.
Yeah, don't say any more because people may want to read your book next year.
It's really interesting. Yeah. Well, it's hard to fill in that gap between when Arthur dies and when Catherine of Aragon marries Henry VIII. We know that she claimed to have been reduced to poverty. Now, keep in mind, she's a teenager when she's writing this. And even if she is a very calm, noble-minded teenager, she's still a teenager. And I have a teenager in my house whom I adore, but they have a flair for being a little bit exaggerating a little bit. So I'm not saying that she wasn't reduced to poverty and that she wasn't having a difficult time, but we don't know how extreme it was. We also know or have an inkling now of why her father wasn't constantly sending her money. We also know that she was spending her money in strange ways. She had a religious person, and I can't remember his rank. I think he acted as her confessor, and I'm sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head, but she had a very, very close relationship with this man and would buy him books and would effectively do whatever he said, to the point where it seemed like an inappropriate relationship. So that's really all we have. And that doesn't come out until a year or two before Henry VIII becomes king and marries Catherine of Aragon. So there is definitely a gap between 1502 and about 1508, 1507 of what Catherine was up to and why she was still in England.
So would she have remained in Ludlow after Arthur died? Or would she have more or less moved to England straight away? Or is that a part of the story that we're not quite sure about? You know, a movement, if you like?
We know that she was brought from Ludlow into the London area.
Yeah.
Just because there's later records that show expenses and also just show that that's where she was located, nearer to the seat of power. Because the only reason she was sent to Ludlow was to live with Arthur. And having a foreign princess in a faraway place probably didn't seem like a good idea. So she was brought back into the London area.
It's interesting. We know it. Her father's decisions, I guess, complicated a vulnerable position in England, I guess. But despite that, she initially maintained Henry's favour for quite a time. Now, Catherine, as we know, struggled to have children, although it didn't seem to displease Henry at the time. And of course, Mary was the only survivor. But at what point do you think Henry thought enough is enough?
Well, I wanted to say she didn't struggle to have children. She struggled to have children that survived.
Well, yeah.
But that is an important distinction. It wasn't, she did have some miscarriages or late-term miscarriages, but of the 6 children she had, most of them were either full-term stillborn or they died shortly after being born. And then, as you mentioned, Mary's the only one that survived infancy and into adulthood. So she had no trouble getting pregnant and she had no trouble having children. She just had trouble having children that lived. And Henry's issue was that in English history, and there's no journal, so we can only engage in conjecture about this sort of thing. He didn't write a diary every day saying, well, these are my thoughts on having only a daughter as an heir and not having a son. But when we look at English history, there really wasn't a precedent for a woman becoming queen regnant of England. And the only attempt at that with Empress Matilda did not go well. So Henry wanted a son. He knew in his mind that he was not the problem, that he could father sons, that he could father healthy babies, because he had Princess Mary with Catherine of Aragon in 1516. And then a year and a half, 2 years later, along comes Henry Fitzroy, a healthy baby boy who unfortunately dies at the age of 17 in 1536. But so Henry was just very anxious about holding on to the throne, and it seems he did not believe he could do that with a daughter. We have to remember that Henry VIII's father was an usurper, as were Catherine of Aragon's parents. They usurped the throne of Castile. So there's this anxiety and this tension that I believe was present in Henry's mind. And without his son, how could he stabilize his kingdom and have a calm succession when the time came for him to pass away?
Do you think that, from what I've read, that Henry kind of understood the need to have a boy, possibly more so than, because he was a second-born brother. Well, he was brother to Arthur, obviously. And if Arthur had lived, things would have been quite possibly completely different. But because when Arthur died and he just was kind of, I guess, thrust upon the throne as he was next in line, do you think it was always in the back of his mind that he needed more than one boy? He needed maybe 2 or 3 to really solidify the dynasty?
Absolutely. As you were just mentioning, Henry had firsthand experience with being the extra son. And by the time Henry is in his 30s, he has just one daughter, and he doesn't have another child that's legitimate. So yes, I would agree with that. And he was also seeing the issues perhaps in Spain with Catherine of Aragon's sister, Juana of Castile, inheriting the throne of Castile from their mother, Isabella. And that also went very poorly for Juana of Castile. So Henry might have had all of these things in his mind when looking at the fact that he just had the one daughter.
I mean, when Henry eventually saw that annulment from Rome, it must have been kind of a devastating blow for a queen who, at the time, was so admired and respected in England. And so, in your eyes, or in your opinion, I guess, how devastating would this have been for such a well-loved queen?
I think for Catherine, she might have been looking more towards her daughter's future than her own. So even if Catherine had a great deal of pride in herself and her position, Catherine knew firsthand from her own family what happens when a marriage is declared annulled and a daughter gets lost in being removed from being the heir apparent. So when we look at Catherine's mother, Isabella was the younger half-sister of Henry IV of Castile. Henry IV, his wife was named Joan of Portugal. Henry and Joan allegedly had a daughter, Joanna of Castile, together, but Henry had been regarded as impotent. Joan of Portugal, his wife, was very good at flirting with everyone. In 1468, Henry declared his marriage to Joan of Portugal invalid and had it annulled. This made their daughter, Joanna of Castile, it temporarily removed her from the succession, and there was some back and forth with Henry IV, who was a very weak king, sometimes declaring his sister Isabella of Castile the heir, and sometimes declaring his daughter of dubious paternity the heir. And things were not helped at all by Joan of Portugal, Juana of Castile's mother, and Henry IV's wife going on to have an illegitimate pair of twins out of wedlock. So Catherine, if she knew anything about how her mother got to the throne, would already understand that how dangerous it would be for a little princess to wake up as princess one day and then have her dad say, "Nope, I'm not married to your mother anymore. You are now in this gray area of inheritance, and we're going to toy with your future." So with the annulment and Henry agitating for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, I think that she was probably more concerned about what would happen to Mary. So Henry would have had to remove Catherine from court regardless. And I think that she knew that that was something that would have to happen. Either she'd be placed in a convent or she'd just be shipped off as she was later on to a distant location far enough away from court. But I really think that from her family history and what she knew about that probably influenced her behavior during the annulment and greatly fueled her fear for the future of her daughter, Mary. And I think that was her main issue with the annulment. So again, we don't have diaries from these people, but we can look at what their family histories are and how that might have impacted them in their own personal lives in the future.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating period of time, this actually, because it must have been incredibly kind of heartbreaking for Catherine, regardless of what was going on in the background. And the fact that it dragged on for 7 years, partly due to the Pope's reluctance to upset Charles V, raises, I guess, an interesting question about Catherine's options, which would be, in hindsight, could Catherine have played a role to intervene and accept the outcome sooner?
She could have. She absolutely could have. But then she wouldn't be protecting her daughter.
Do you think the reason it went for 7 years is purely because Mary was there?
That and the other issue, and I go into this in a little bit more detail in my book about Catherine of Aragon, is Charles V, his family and Catherine's family had habits of marrying uncles to nieces. Two of Catherine's sisters were married to the same monarch in Portugal, and Charles V's wife was a descendant of that monarch. So the other issue that we're seeing is within the Catholic Church, if a precedent is established that sibling one marries spouse, then dies, and sibling two marries spouse, and if that is declared an invalid marriage because there might have been consummation, that would have completely undone a chunk of the legitimacy of Charles V's wife and his children with that wife, which would include Philip II. So it's not just how Henry's annulment, had it been granted by the Pope or had Catherine consented to this annulment, would have impacted England. It's how it would have rippled across the Holy Roman Empire. It would have been a big problem. So, yes, I think that she clung on for a long time because of Mary, but it's also very possible that she clung on because of the danger it posed to not just Catherine, but her nephew, Charles V, and several of her other relatives that were deceased at that time. But it just could have completely undone the Spanish monarchy along with the Holy Roman Empire. And that's a lot of responsibility for one woman to have on her shoulders.
And do you think that it could quite possibly have been that she loved Henry that much, she didn't want to lose him? Is that possible?
Yeah.
It's just a simple, I love my husband dearly, and I don't recognize him as the man who I married. He's changed completely, and it's very hard to understand and to get into that psyche, isn't it, about somebody like that?
Well, and if I may, and I have worked on family law or divorce cases before, and that absolutely happens too, is sometimes people are just married for a long time and one of them changes in an unexpected way, and that one spouse just doesn't recognize the other anymore. And just seeing people, in my personal experience go through that it's absolutely awful, because how do you even reconcile that? So that absolutely would probably be an element for Catherine. So not only caring about what could happen to her daughter, fears over what could happen to her whole family and the control and power that her family has. But yeah, maybe she just really loved Henry. I know we like to call Henry, I think there was an article that just came out that he was a serial killer, which is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. I mean, it's great for clickbait, right? But
I guess he did. I guess he could be a serial killer by the amount of people he had executed. So if that's where they're going with that line, then
a lot of monarchs were serial killers. I think that was exactly normal. Yeah. But I think that in particular in the last maybe 10 years or so, when I've really been paying attention, to be quite honest, it's very in vogue to pitch Henry as this horrible, awful person. He had 6 wives. What a garbage human being. And he was so vicious. And that, again, that's the sexy storyline, right? But when we actually look at how he behaved as a king, how he administered his country, did he want to be married 6 times? I don't think he ever set out to be married 6 times. I think
No.
he set out to be married once. That became untenable because he had no son. Then he decided to get married a second time. That went poorly.
Yeah.
And then Jane died. So I don't think that Henry woke up and decided he was going to have all these wives. But I think that right now it's just so popular to say, oh, he was a horrible misogynist serial killer. And he definitely had those elements, but he was also a man of his times. And maybe we need to look at him as far as how he was as a king, removed from being married 6 times, because he did more than get married 6 times. So,
Despite the drawn out annulment process and the complex political force at play, I guess, Catherine's refusal to concede was obviously steadfast. And even in her final years, her determination remained unshaken. Being a virtual prisoner at Kimbolton Castle, what motivation do you think Catherine had to keep up her appeals to Henry over the legitimacy of her marriage?
I really think it was to protect Mary, like we've been talking about. It's if Mary is suddenly exposed to being an illegitimate daughter, that exposes her to being removed from the line of succession. It exposes her to possibly being banished from court, or at least exiled from court and held in custody somewhere, and all sorts of other unpleasant things. It also possibly removes her from being able to have a good marriage, a good political or financial match if she's just an illegitimate daughter, because it's not just the marriage between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII being annulled. It's completely changing the status of their surviving daughter, Mary. And Catherine, even if she did genuinely love Henry, I'm sure she loved her daughter more.
Yeah, she possibly did, especially after the way, I guess, she was treated or asked to go to Kimbolton in the first place and kind of sit out the remaining years of her life, even though it was, I guess, she had that commitment to that marriage and a daughter, like we've said, and I think it must have been really difficult for her to kind of just let it go completely.
Well, and it also struck at, when we think about it, or think about really any divorce or annulment, it was an annulment for Catherine, but it really strikes into the heart of a person's identity. I mean, you have Catherine of Aragon, her parents are the Catholic monarchs. Catherine's very pious. She loves her husband, whether she loves him out of genuine affection or she loves him out of duty. She loves her husband, and she's been Queen of England now for more than 20 years. She's been a wife for more than 20 years. She's been a Catholic her whole life. And suddenly Henry's attacking all of that. He's taking away her status as a wife. He's taking away her status as a queen. He's threatening to undo, and then does eventually undo, Catholicism in England. I mean, these were multiple attacks on Catherine of Aragon's psyche and ego, and not ego in the sense of being egotistical, but our ego is how we view ourselves. And it would have been, I think the fact that she just didn't have an utter breakdown is a miracle in and of itself. I mean, he was completely ripping everything away from Catherine, and maybe he didn't view it that way. And even if he did understand that that's what he was doing, he didn't have the space to care about that because he had to look after the kingdom and had to have sons. But Catherine was under all sorts of psychological and spiritual and emotional attack at the end of her life, with all these things being taken away from her, and then adding the burden. And I don't mean burden in like a negative way, but just this sense of duty for her daughter and for the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, that's really, really heavy, serious stuff for one person to be thinking about and dealing with. Like, so she has her personal things that she's dealing with, which are her sudden change in her identity. And we see this, I'm not a psychologist at all, but again, with my work in family law, you see this with people whose marriages are ending. Some of them, unfortunately, if that's been a major part of their identity, which how could it not be? And then that's going away because someone's trying to take it away from them. That's a major psychological event. And so Catherine's going through at least 3 or 4 different types of psychological events on top of just the annulment And I can't imagine how much strength she had to have to carry on and persevere. And all she could do was appeal to Henry to stop the madness and to protect Mary.
Do you think the duty came above commitment for her?
Yes. Yes, I think so.
Because that is something, I guess, that would be expected, the duty side of things. But the commitment to the marriage, the commitment to a daughter, I guess, would be secondary in that particular period of time. Maybe different today, but I'm guessing, because one thing that's always fascinated me is when you see like these dramas and they go and get executed and they stand up and they do the little speech and they always praise Henry as the highest thing, the greatest man that's ever lived. And you think, well, if that happened today, a lot of people wouldn't be saying stuff like that. They'd be saying the complete opposite, what a tyrant he was, or how nasty he was, or whatever. So I'm guessing it's the duty side of the relationship had to be above the commitment side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think so.
I think it does to you. It might not, it doesn't to me.
Well, because his behavior was so extreme.
Yeah.
Because again, it's not just, oh, I want this marriage annulled or I want a divorce. It's, I want to annul this marriage. I want to make my one living child illegitimate, or my one legitimate living child illegitimate, because we still had Henry Fitzroy kicking around in the background in hopes of having legitimate sons with another lady. And I want to totally reform the church because I'm not getting my way. And I don't want this person as my queen anymore. So, I mean, it was very extreme behavior, but that's because of their positions in society. If they were not king and queen, it still would have been not good to go through an annulment after 20 some odd years of marriage, but it would not have been as extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination if they had been anyone other than who they were.
Do you think Henry should not have had a duty to his wife?
Oh, absolutely.
Because clearly he doesn't seem to. He just goes off on tangents the whole time. He just kind of, I don't know. It's like a child with a new toy. He just seems to. He puts up with it for a little period of time, and then he thinks, "I've had enough of this," and he moves on to something else. And it's really strange.
I think his duty was more to his country than to any of his wives. I think that's the theme that underlies all of this. So when we look at Catherine of Aragon, they didn't have a son. He needs a legitimate son. She can't be queen anymore. He needs to protect England and keep it stable. So then he has an annulment. Anne Boleyn, I'm writing a book about her after I finish this Catherine of Aragon book. And it's very interesting how she got herself to the end to which she came. But so then he marries Anne Boleyn. He's like, okay, now we've got this new church. I need to have stability. And then, oh no, this lady's dabbling in things she shouldn't be. We have to get rid of her. So then they get rid of her. And then, okay, I'm going to marry this Jane lady. She seems calm and plain Jane, if you will, not regarding her looks, but regarding her political entanglements. And then they have a son. This is great. I have a son. Oh no, Jane's dead. I need more sons. I know what it's like to be the second son. So then he marries Anna, and with Anna, he thinks maybe this will be a good counterbalance to the power of the French, and maybe get him in a positive light within the Holy Roman Empire. And then that's not at all what happens, and England's in danger again of being roped into an international war. So, oh no, I need to annul my marriage to Anna. Oh look, here's this cute teenager. She doesn't have parents to protect her. I'll marry her. Oh no, she may or may not have had relationships with other men before we got married that weren't disclosed, which means that if we did have any children, they could be declared illegitimate, and we can't have that. So it keeps going. So when we look at Henry, I really think that he was his highest sense of duty was to his country, which is perhaps appropriate for a king to put his country before everything else. And I don't think Henry was a great person at all, but sometimes I like to look at him beyond the fact that he was married 6 times. So I don't think that he constantly had shiny new toy syndrome all the time. I just think that he took his responsibility to the throne and to the country a lot more seriously. And maybe we don't think about that if we're just looking at, oh, he ditched Catherine of Aragon so he could marry a younger woman. Because again, that's the sexy story, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I don't know. It's just how the story's being told, I guess, over time, isn't it? Because we know for the fact that Tudors can't be trusted when it comes down to creating their written works. They've been known to, you know, embellish them a little bit, shall we say? But anyway, let's go back to Catherine. Finally, reflecting on her strength and dignity, it begs the question of how she should be remembered today. And are there any inspirational moments that you could share about her?
I think Catherine's legacy, when we think about her, shouldn't be just that she was the first wife that was ditched, of course. I think that we need to remember all the culture that she brought into England, her enduring impacts that way, that she was very educated and also was interested in education and saw to it that her daughter Mary was well educated, that Catherine supported the arts, that she had political acumen, and that she behaved in some ways as ambassador for her father when he was still alive. I think that Catherine should be remembered for being a dutiful queen. So, a dutiful queen, not only in her capacity as a wife, but in her capacity as a member of court, a political figure, and a mother. And so to diminish Catherine to the last few years of her relationship with Henry, the last few years of her wife, or to diminish her, excuse me, as last few years of her life, I said wife, I meant to say life, or to diminish her to being a woman who couldn't successfully have a child, which first of all isn't true. The babies just all died, except Mary, is really a great disservice to who this person was. And I think that overall, when we're looking in the past at people, we need to remember that these were people who lived, who suffered joy, tragedy, and who died. And they aren't just characters from a story that we pluck up 500 years later. These were real people. And so my hope for Catherine's legacy is that people can put aside the fact that she was married to Henry. I mean, that's why we know about her, but look at all the other things that she did and look at how she behaved rather than what happened to her. And as far as any particularly touching stories, I don't have one off the top of my head. I'm sorry for that.
It's all right. But have you ever been to the UK then and been around
Oh,
some of these places? Yeah.
yes,
So
absolutely.
have you
Yes.
been to Peterborough Cathedral and seen where she's buried?
I haven't gotten that far. I admit I'm usually in and around London and the Surrey area, but I do wind up going to the UK at least once a year.
It's worth a trip. I mean, it's not a million miles from me actually, but I've never been to see it yet. But maybe one day. Especially
Yeah.
now they've got Richard III, which is not a million miles away from me either in Leicester. So anyway, I'm diversing. That's the
No,
end of
that's
our
okay.
that's the end of our questions, Heather. And I'm sure the folks watching this would love to know where they can find you online, and also tell us about your new book in 2025.
So you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and Threads. I feel like I'm the most active on Instagram at this point, but it's on Facebook. It's Heather R. Darsie Historian. On Twitter and Threads, it's at HR Darsie History. And then on Instagram, I forgot that I had a middle name. So it's just at H Darsie History. And my book that's coming out in the spring. Oh my God, I just lost the title. Give me one second.
It might be Catherine of Aragon or something like that.
It is, but I think it's Catherine of Aragon. Not as simple as I may say. I just can't believe I just forgot what the name of the.
Don't
Here
worry.
it is. Okay, I'm ready.
Right.
So the title of the book, it's set for release right now in mid-May, so hopefully it'll remain on track. But it's called Catherine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. I'm not as simple as I may seem, and that's being published through Amberley, and it is available for pre-order in, I believe, both the U.S. and the U.K. right now, but definitely the U.K. You can find it on Amazon. You can go to Amberley's website. So there's multiple different ways for that. If you don't want to wait to read that book, I do have 3 other nonfiction and 1 fiction book. So I already mentioned my books about Anna and her family. So Anna, Duchess of Cleves, the king's beloved sister, and Children of the House of Cleves, Anna and her siblings. And I had another book that just came out. If you're more interested in English and Scottish history. It's called Stuart Spouses, a compendium of consorts from James I of Scotland. So not James I and six of Scotland and England, but James I of Scotland. So we're going all the way back to Joan Beaufort as a spouse, up through Queen Anne of Great Britain. So, and then I have a little fiction novella that I published called Diary of a Plague Doctor's Wife, if you want to read something like that. So those are all of my books. I also have a website, maidensandmanuscripts.com, but I admit that I don't update that as often as I used to.
Okay. Well, it's great. And don't forget, everybody, if you want to link to anything Heather related, they will be in that description box below. So, Heather, thank you so much for taking the time, enlightening us on this journey today through the life of Catherine of Aragon. I guess your passion, depth of knowledge have truly brought her story to life, and we'll be able to read all about that next year. And it's clear that Catherine was a woman of immense strength and resilience. And you know, if Catherine were around today, she'd probably remind us that patience really is a virtue after all, especially enduring that 7-year annulment process. So thank you again for sharing your insights and making history feel so vivid, I guess, and engaging.
Thank you. And thank you for having me.
It's been really, really, really nice. Thanks for joining me. And as always, to everyone who's tuned in today, thank you so much. We've still got some more incredible guests coming on History Speaks. So if you love history, you'll love History Roadshow. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our historical interviews or stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.